And now I will start. And you should see my browser and the presentation. Okay, it's something I really put together kind of quickly. So ignore mistakes if you see them, language mistakes. Normally I give those presentations in German or in Dutch. All right, maybe it's interesting to have a look at what I do before we start about talking about podcasts. What I do is I'm a podcast consultant. So I help companies, single people, and bigger media houses here in Germany, especially with making podcasts, creating ideas, but also distributing them and market them properly so they get in touch with a bigger audience. But I'm also a guitarist. This is what I did at ArtEZ. I studied guitar and I'm part of a rock band called 10 Times a Million. So we mainly play in the Netherlands. We do festivals, club shows, and all that kind of stuff. But I'm also a podcaster myself. I'm really into awareness work. And this is what my podcasts are all about. What I do as a consultant is like really huge stuff. And yeah, you see some of the clients, and this is maybe a little introduction. Okay, the term podcast originally comes from iPod and from broadcast. So it's two words that were put together. And actually, if you put them together, it is like a radio you carry around. This is where it comes from. And Apple is like the third-party company that made podcasts what they are today. They established the name podcast, and it comes from iPod in combination with broadcast. But nowadays, it is not radio anymore. And this is actually a big part of my job when I do consultancy for big media houses and radio stations. What I do is like always say, hey, we're not doing radio, we're doing podcasts. And I'm the bad guy who is always reminding like the editorial stuff to think a little bit differently about audio products in the digital realm, I would say. All right, what is a podcast? A podcast is a digital audio product that can be downloaded or streamed over the internet. It is typically a series of episodes that can cover a wide range of topics, such as news, entertainment, education, and more. And podcasts can be listened to on a variety of devices, such as smartphones, tablets, and computers, making them a convenient way to consume content on the go. And this is actually, so we're coming back to the word podcast. It still is what it is. You carry the audio around and you listen whenever you want to listen and you stop whenever you want to stop. So it's like the Netflix principle, actually. You stop and go whenever you like to. And this is like a huge difference to linear radio production. Why should you start a podcast? There are many reasons. So I just try to put the most important ones in this presentation. A podcast impacts branding. So if you have a brand, you have a company, or you yourself as a single person, you're also a brand sometimes, and you can expand your branding. A podcast can generate extra reach if you do the right things. You can really get in touch with an audience that is within your niche, and then you can get in touch with a bigger audience that is potentially interested in yourself, in you and yourself. A podcast stimulates bonding. It's very personal, or when you do it the right way, you create a very personal atmosphere, and this makes it so bonding, actually, and it's way closer than watching a video short content or reading a blog, because you really want to create the feeling. It depends on the format, but you want to create the feeling that you're almost standing next to the person who's making the podcast. A podcast can target a specific niche. A podcast is a new and important media channel. I see it like this. It's a media channel in a mix of a lot of ways to communicate with your community, with your audience. So it can be TikTok, it can be Instagram, it can be Facebook, it can be YouTube, it can be everything. But podcast is an important part of this mix. And so, you should not neglect it. And a podcast can be great to position yourself as an expert in your field. And a podcast is a great way to expand your network in an authentic way. This is kind of cool when you do an interview format, when you talk to other people you don't know before, but you get in touch because of the podcast. and you meet up, you set up all your gear and you start the recording, and you have like a mini radio station that's set up and going. And someone you are maybe inviting to your podcast who has never been to a podcast before, it creates a very special atmosphere for this person who is your guest. And it's an experience that person will never forget. So you are like connected in a very special way. And that's very interesting way to expand your network. And it's fun to make, especially as being a musician, because there's production involved, there's sound design involved, there's all kinds of stuff involved that is interesting for musicians. So this is what is fascinating for me about the whole podcast world. Okay, why a podcast in Germany? Because I'm based in Cologne and I mainly advise German companies and media houses. More than 45 million people in Germany listen to web radio or online audio content, which includes podcasts on a monthly base. 45 million is more than the half of the population of Germany. And 4 out of 10 use audio in the internet on a daily basis. Strong growth, actually right now, with podcasts, radio on demand, and music via YouTube. And this is not something I just write down because I think so. These are like study results. And in this case, we talk about the ArtEZ ZDF online Studie. And this is the legal broadcaster in Germany. And recently, podcast and radio on demand consumption is significantly growing within the age group of 50 plus. This is the last year of 2021 to 22. These are the latest studies. During the pandemic, it was the younger group of listeners who really got in touch with podcasting, who had the biggest growth. And in the last year, it was like 50 plus. So like the baby boomers are discovering podcasts, which is quite interesting. Why a podcast in the Netherlands? Almost 7 million Dutch people listen to a podcast sometimes. 1 out of 4 listen daily or weekly. And maybe this is interesting too. Frequent listeners listen 116 minutes average on a weekly basis. And it's a little less women than men. But overall, people who are listening to podcasts are higher educated and 66% younger up until the age of 34. And this is Marked Effect Podcast Monitor, and that's the 7th study, which came out last year. All right, motivation for listening to a podcast. Why should you listen to a podcast? Because I can do other things while listening. That's the difference to watching TikTok videos, YouTube videos. You can do other stuff. And this is like a very important use case when we talk about podcasts. And you listen to podcasts because you want to receive background reports, for example, about current affairs. You want to learn something about a specific topic. You listen because of fun and relaxation. So entertainment, infotainment reasons. Being part of a community is a very important one. And there are different use cases, especially when we talk about we can do other things while listening. There's the use case at home. And when we talk about listening podcasts at home, from studies, you can see that most people listen next to doing housework, but also without doing anything. And this is mostly in the evening while you fall asleep when you're listening to a podcast, and next to while you're eating. So these are the 3 most common use cases at home. And the 3 most common use cases outdoor are in the car, in the bus or train, or in the bike or by foot. So when you're doing something and it's maybe a little bit boring if you don't listen to anything, or you want to listen to something else than just music, then you listen to a podcast. Okay, when I do consultancy, there are 3 pillars that are important in podcasting. And this is the content. And it's very similar to music. If the content is shit, you do not have to pay attention to the other 2 pillars, because it has to be really good content. It has to create a value, like entertain or give a valuable information. And people who are recording a podcast need to be able to talk efficiently into a microphone and create a good episode. Now, content first, then you look at the technique. So what kind of gear are you using to produce a podcast, and how you do the post-production and stuff. And then the 3rd pillar is distribution and marketing. So how do you get to all those platforms? How do you market it? So it's not only distribution, how to get there, but when you get there, people have to find you and you want to grow an audience. And this is where a lot of podcasts reach a plateau and they don't go any further because it's sometimes it can be difficult to market it properly. And of course, a big part of it is like looking at the data and try to analyze what is performing well and what is performing not so well in order to make conclusions and to do it better in upcoming episodes. And this is cool about podcasting because you can adjust along the way. It doesn't has to be perfect in the first episode. You can develop your skills, you can develop your quality and stuff along the way. So yeah, you don't have to start perfect. So, and we have a look at the first pillar, and this is content. And then you can think about, okay, what I want to do as a podcast. And this is a brief explanation of what you can do. You can really go into depth into everything what I'm talking about. Okay, it's like really in short form. There are talk podcasts. You can talk solo. You can talk in a duo, so with someone else, with a co-host, or you can do an interview podcast. And it could be that there are more people involved than just 2 people. Could be 3 or 4 people. But then you are on an audio level. You really have to be careful that voices are not sounding too similar, because then it gets really difficult for people to differentiate between who is now talking and who is not talking. Or you can do a storytelling podcast. These are, if you want to do a storytelling podcast the right way, it's a bigger production. It's a more expensive production, and it involves a lot of planning, like scripting, and it can be fictional or based on facts. Then you have science podcasts, you have news podcasts, you have topic-based podcasts like about, for example, music, sex, travel, whatsoever. And of course, you have mixed formats. Like, for example, you can have an interview podcast, and sometimes in the feed you do solo episodes. For example, because the host wants to build a reputation as an expert in a certain way. When you interview people, you're not always in the position to show yourself as an expert because you want to ask good questions. So this would be an example to do a mixed form, like interview with solo. But you can also do a topic-based podcast with storytelling elements. You have various possibilities to combine formats. Okay, a few do's, what you can do and what is mostly right when you create a podcast. Expectability in length and release rhythm. You don't have to, but it's advisable, because what you want to do is you want to imagine I'm listening to a podcast always while I'm cooking, and I'm cooking half an hour. So what a podcaster wants is that he or she can fit in that half hour. So it's advisable to maybe create something within 20 minutes, 25 minutes. So it's easy for me to click on it in order to consume it while I'm cooking. And then I can fully listen to the whole episode. And the next time I'm cooking, I'm checking, oh, is there another episode? And so it gets a routine. As a podcaster, we want to get in this routine, especially in the beginning when you're not famous or when you don't have any other like variables to get a bigger audience. That's like expectability is a good thing to start with. When you're bigger, when you are an influencer starting a podcast and you have a fan base already, no one gives a shit. You can do like longer episodes and people will still listen to it, but you always have to look at the specific case. Then structure. It's always good to have a structure, like an intro, outro. Maybe you have a recap, like a very specific part in the episode that's so interesting in the middle or in the end, so that you put it up front to have a little appetizer to get people into the show. Then CTA, like a call to action. Is there a specific moment where you can ask people for feedback and stuff like that? Show notes are the text when you open up your podcast app and you have a text, and when you mention like books, when you mention stuff you're talking about, you should put it in a podcast description, which are the show notes with links, so that people find stuff and don't have to look and lose a lot of time. A podcast should be personal and authentic. It should be transparent and honest. It should create value. I've mentioned this before, like entertainment, information, or infotainment. It's like a mix of both. It should be community caring. So you always should have moments where you talk with your audience and involve them and ask them for feedback like you would do in a CTA. And of course, it always depends on the format, but mostly a podcast is based on the quality of the hosts. and the people who are guests in most cases. So it's very important that there is a vibe, kind of flow, kind of chemistry, kind of energy going on. And of course, if there is the possibility and you're capable of it, then do like storytelling. Then a few don'ts: bad audio quality and bad cutting. Voices are not sympathetic, so you don't want to really listen to them. And sometimes, and that's not bad judging, but sometimes there are people who, when you have a picture, when you have video picture and you have the voice, it works, but only the voice is not working for some reason. Maybe this is the case. It's the last point here. It's audio is not the right channel for content or the person. So you really have to take a look at that. Podcast don'ts are as well, for example, also no structure and expectability. We talked about it. No value, promises are not kept, or when you do inhuman statements. And that's kind of clear, right? All right. Let's take a look at podcast technique. With microphones, you should ask yourself the question, dynamic or condenser. Condenser is, it depends on the microphone and it depends on the price, but mostly it sounds a little bit better because it's recording more frequencies. When you are in a studio that's closed, that's pretty fine. Okay, cool. But in most cases, you have a lot of background noises and you would decide for a dynamic microphone. And you can ask yourself the question, how do you want to connect it? Is it a USB mic or with XLR? What kind of price and budget do you have? What kind of size we are talking about and weight? Maybe you want to produce a podcast while you're traveling. So it's interesting to have a look at this as well. And what situation you are recording in. And that's the same when you ask yourself, what kind of interface do I want to choose for producing a podcast? Yes or no? So when you have a USB mic, you can connect it to your laptop and you don't need an interface at all. Sometimes it can be better to have an interface for better audio quality, maybe because you want to have an SD card, maybe because you want to use a kind of preamp, because some microphones need a preamp in order to get enough input, like the Shure SM7B, which is like a very great podcast microphone, but you need a preamp in order to run it properly. And what kind of functionality you want to have. Some interfaces have like pads, you can program them, and then you have like sounds you can use during the recordings, which is pretty cool when you have an interview guest and you have certain sounds and you can use them while having the conversation with a guest. Do you want to make a phone call during the recording, or do you want to use the interface as a field recording microphone as well? So there are many questions, and it depends on what kind of situation you are recording in. And again, size and weight, if you want to travel a lot while producing a podcast, this is an argument as well you should consider for the right choice. And studio program, of course, you should ask yourself, am I using a Mac or Windows? What kind of functionalities do I need? What kind of price do I want to pay? You don't have to have Pro Tools or Logic. There are many free software tools you can use for producing a podcast, like GarageBand, Audacity, or even Anchor. That's what is the hosting platform from Spotify itself, and you can produce a podcast in there as well. My recommendation for a higher budget is using a Shure SM7B, but it's my personal taste. I really love the sound of this microphone, and you can also use it for other stuff as well. If you want to produce music, I mean, you are buying an evergreen microphone, so it's great stuff. Biodynamic headphones, pretty common ones in every radio station. Zoom H6. This one you can, it's an interface with an SD card, but you can use it as a field microphone. So it's small. You can travel with it pretty easily. And I would use Logic Pro or Reaper with Ultraschall, which is really like a podcast solution for podcast productions. And if you have a lower budget, I would recommend a Shure MV7. And this is like, you don't have to use an interface. You can connect it to your MacBook or to your laptop. And then you use like Audacity or Anchor or GarageBand. So you don't have to pay anything. And you can pretty easily record a good sounding podcast with this equipment. And you can also travel. Okay, last pillar, and then we're done. Distribution and marketing. Let's say we have recorded some naked audios. What we're going to do with them? These audios are going to get metadata. And when you combine all these audios with metadata, and you do this mostly in a podcast hosting platform, then you get an RSS feed. And this RSS feed is finally, you have like one URL, and this is the RSS feed, and this is what you give to all the third-party platforms like Apple Podcasts, like Spotify, like Amazon Music. With this RSS feed, you can upload your podcast. It's pretty simple. And yes, every podcast hoster is like making it pretty easy to create an RSS feed nowadays. So what you have when you're distributing a podcast is you have your own infrastructure. So you have your RSS feed and you have a homepage, which comes along with an RSS feed, like the HTML version of the RSS feed is in most cases a website you can use. And then you have the third-party platforms, which are very important to distribute to, because then all the other podcast apps, which are not that famous, like podcatchers, they crawl the RSS feed. So if you distribute to all the bigger platforms, all the smaller apps are going to get the information as well, and you are on a good way to distribute your podcast properly. And what is interesting to mention as well is you should claim your podcast, like you can do it with music as well. There are also always like podcast backends for every third-party platform, and you can claim your own podcast and you can see the data there as well. You have data in your podcast hosting platform, but you can also have a look at your data in Spotify, in Apple, and Amazon, and you can compare it to each other. It's not that easy to compare, but it's good to see where is the biggest audience listening to your podcast. And then you can see how long they are listening to an episode and stuff like that. So it's always good to claim your podcast at the third-party platforms. And then there are a lot of strategies to market a podcast. This is like very brave overview, but we are not going into depth. It's almost the last slide. You can work out a social media strategy, looking at what kind of channels do you have and how you can convert social media audience to a podcast. You can do this organically, but you can also do it with ads, and you can do visual ads on social media platforms like Facebook, Meta ads, Facebook, Instagram, but you can do also audio ads via Spotify and via other platforms. So there are many possibilities to target a niche, and maybe that niche you want to get in touch with. So ads are really like something very interesting to consider with marketing a podcast. Do you have a secondary channel? Do you have an Instagram account that is made up for the podcast, or a YouTube channel? And maybe this is the channel where you get feedback, or you just using an email address or a WhatsApp group. It's possible as well. But it's always good to have a secondary channel in order to get feedback from your community, in order to work with the feedback from your community. So this creates like it's a two-way street then, and not a one-way street. And when you're podcasting for yourself, it's always good to listen to your audience and then to adjust and make it a two-way street. And therefore is a secondary channel. You can think about vodcasting. So this is video podcasting. So you just basically film yourself while producing a podcast, and then you can like make snippets of it, maybe also snippets in short video content form, and you can upload them to TikTok, to Instagram Reels, and to Facebook Reels, and to YouTube Shorts, because this is a great way to get a lot of attention at the moment, because all the platforms are pushing short video content. And you see a lot of podcasts doing well. So this is a good idea to try. Then you can do trailer feed drops, very interesting. You look for other podcasts that are similar in your niche, and you ask them to publish your trailer for your show in exchange for whatever. But so an audience will discover you. We don't have the time to discuss how to do this, but that's a possibility. Then you can do third-party promo. You can promote your podcast on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music itself, and you have to get in touch with them, and it's difficult when you're small. It's more realistic when you're a bigger media house, for example, but it's possible. So you always should give it a try. You can do SEO for podcasting, so search engine optimization, and there are basically two ways to do SEO. It's like editorial and technical, and editorial is the easier way for yourself. It's like looking at keywords. How do you want to name your podcast? How do you want to name certain episodes? You can use keyword tools in order to find out what kind of keywords people are looking for regarding to your topic. And then you most likely would choose a keyword. And a keyword is not just only one word, it's a combination of more words. You're looking for a word that has less competition, at least not a big competition, but a high volume in searches. And this sweet spot is what you want to get. And this, I mean, if you use keyword tools, you can easily decide what keyword could be useful for your episode. Yeah, and you should be consistent in your CI, in your corporate identity. So how does the podcast look as well, and how does it sound? Is it a sound design that's, you know, remarkable, that you can remember? Is it a visual look you can remember? When you have a podcast cover, but you also have a podcast single episode covers, you can use them. You have a website design, and it should be also always presented in the same kind of look and feel in order to be remembered. Yeah, you can use a newsletter or release radars in order to get attention for your podcast. You can do cross-promotion. There are cross-promotion networks, but you can do it manually yourself as well, like with a cross-promotion Excel or Google spreadsheet. You can, use an app if you have an app, or you should definitely use your homepage, and also have a look at your homepage and optimize it with the right SEO strategy. And then data and analysis. So here are a few examples how it can look like. You have a Spotify retention rate. This is the episode performance. You have like demographic insights. How many followers do you have? It gets pretty difficult because you have many platforms, and you really have to know what you look for. But when you're getting used to it, like after every episode release, then you start to you see what is performing well, what is performing less, and you can look at the keywords and match the performance with your keyword search results, and like have a look at what is working, what is not working. And this should be an ongoing process. You should be getting used to it, to like look at the data. So like you also should get to use to look at the data at Instagram and TikTok in order to realize what content is performing best and you should focus on. And that's it. Small ride into the podcast world.